The sound of steel doors slamming shut echoes differently when money is involved. To most people, a prison is a fortress of punishment, a place where society hides its darkest corners. But to one man, it was an untapped gold mine waiting to be stripped bare. The first time cameras caught him standing in front of the massive gates of Blackridge Penitentiary, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit with his silver watch flashing in the sun, people thought it was another publicity stunt. Billionaires had been buying sports teams, media companies, even entire islands. But a prison? That wasn't just strange, it was disturbing. He smiled for the reporters, shook hands with state officials, and told the crowd he was there to make history. "This is the future of corrections," he said smoothly, the words rolling off his tongue like they had been rehearsed. "A system that works, a system that reforms, a system that saves taxpayers billions while giving these men and women a second chance at life." Applause followed, but not everyone clapped. Some saw through it. Behind the scenes, the deal had been rushed. Documents moved quietly between the governor's office and the billionaire's lawyers. Overnight, what was once a state-run correctional facility was now private property, fully under his control. He promised rehabilitation, education, and work programs that would teach skills. But even in those first few weeks, whispers started to spread. The classrooms remained locked. The libraries stayed dusty. Instead, forklifts roared to life. Machinery was delivered in trucks, and prison yards were sectioned off into what looked more like factory floors than places of reflection. At first, the public bought the dream. News anchors praised the billionaire's innovation. Talk shows invited him to speak about how government inefficiency was draining taxpayers and how his model would cut waste. He looked into the camera with calm confidence, telling America that, for too long, prisons have been about punishment instead of productivity. His words sounded reasonable, almost noble. But inside those walls, reality had already shifted into something much darker. Inmates were woken at 5 a.m. sharp, not for head counts or breakfast, but for work. Rows of men were marched into warehouses filled with sewing machines, welding stations, and assembly lines. Some didn't even know what they were making, only that they were ordered to keep working until the buzzer sounded hours later. Their pay? Cents on the dollar? Sometimes just enough to buy a snack from the commissary, never enough to send home to their families. One inmate, speaking anonymously to a local reporter, described it bluntly. "It's slavery. Just slavery with paperwork." Guards noticed the change too. Their roles shifted from correction officers to factory supervisors. They were told to keep the lines moving, to punish anyone who slowed down. More than one guard admitted later that their orders felt more like corporate training manuals than law enforcement. "It was like working at Amazon with guns," one said years after the scandal broke. But back then, no one was listening. The billionaire's image only grew. He was invited to universities to lecture about reinventing incarceration. He appeared on magazine covers, standing in front of clean, whitewashed prison halls that had been staged for photographers. Behind those photo ops, however, the paint was peeling and the inmates were coughing from dust inhaled on the factory lines. He had turned punishment into a business model, and it was working better than anyone could have imagined. Contracts quietly funneled in. Corporations that wanted cheap labor found an eager partner. From textiles to electronics, products started leaving the prison in unmarked trucks branded later with familiar household names. Consumers had no idea that the shirt they wore or the lamp they bought had been pieced together by men who had no choice. The billionaire, meanwhile, earned millions every month, but cracks started to show. A former teacher who had volunteered at Blackridge before the takeover wrote a furious op-ed. She claimed she was locked out of the prison the moment it was privatized. "They promised education," she wrote, "but they replaced classrooms with conveyor belts. They promised reform, but they replaced books with drills." At first, her words were dismissed. The billionaire's PR team labelled her bitter and misinformed. But those who had family inside the walls knew she was telling the truth. One mother recalled visiting her son after months of silence. When she sat across from him in the visiting room, she barely recognized him. His hands were blistered, his face pale, and his once fit body had thinned dramatically. "Mama, they work us to the bone," he whispered. "It's worse than prison. It's a factory. I don't know how long I can do this." She tried to report it, but who listens to the mother of a convicted felon? Her voice was drowned out in a system built to ignore people like her. The billionaire thrived on that silence. To the world, he was a genius, fixing what government had broken. To the men trapped behind his steel doors, he was something far worse. Blackridge became a machine, its gears greased not with oil, but with human sweat and suffering. The first real jolt came when a young inmate collapsed on the floor of the welding station. He had begged to see a doctor for days, but was told to keep working. By the time help arrived, it was too late. His death was officially recorded as natural causes, but whispers inside the prison said otherwise. Guards murmured about exhaustion, dehydration, and negligence. Inmates called it murder by labor. No one outside those walls heard their voices, at least not yet. A journalist named Clara Benson had been following the story quietly. She had grown suspicious of the billionaire's claims after noticing discrepancies in financial filings. Something didn't add up. Millions in revenue with no clear explanation of where it was coming from. She began digging into Blackridge, filing requests, knocking on doors, and interviewing anyone who would speak. At first, she hit walls. Lawyers refused to comment, state officials dodged questions, and corporate partners denied involvement. But then by chance, a single envelope landed on her desk. Inside was a blurry photocopy of a contract. It showed that Blackridge was supplying parts to a well-known company. At the bottom of the page was a signature, the billionaire's. Clara felt her pulse quicken. She wasn't looking at a theory anymore. She was staring at proof. Proof that America's justice system had been sold off to the highest bidder. Proof that inmates were no longer just prisoners but commodities. She folded the document carefully, knowing that if this ever saw the light of day, the billionaire's empire might begin to crack. But she also knew something else. Exposing him would not be easy. Men like him didn't just have money, they had power. Meanwhile, inside the prison, unrest was brewing. Inmates whispered at night about the death, about the endless hours, about revolting. Some planned small acts of resistance, slowing down on the line, refusing orders. But every attempt was met with swift punishment. Solitary cells filled up, meals were cut, and the fear of retaliation kept most quiet. Still, the anger simmered, and with each passing day, the pressure mounted. What no one knew was that the billionaire wasn't done. Blackridge was only the beginning. He had plans for expansion, bigger contracts, more prisons under his name. He was building an empire on broken backs, and he believed no one could stop him. For a time, he might have been right. But the cracks were spreading, and soon the whole country would hear the whispers coming out of Blackridge. Because behind those walls, something had already snapped. And it was only a matter of time before it spilled out for the world to see. Clara Benson didn't sleep the night she received the contract. The photocopy sat on her desk like a ticking bomb, the billionaire's signature etched across the bottom in bold ink. She knew enough to understand the danger. Whistleblowers often vanished into obscurity, their careers destroyed, their lives threatened. Yet here she was, staring at evidence that a prison was no longer a place of correction, but a production line feeding corporate giants. She poured herself another cup of stale coffee and scrolled through her notes. The numbers matched. The timelines matched. The billionaire's empire was built not just on finance and real estate, but now on the labor of men society had forgotten. She had one question echoing in her head. How far would he go to keep this hidden? Inside Blackridge, the truth was uglier than any contract could describe. Days blurred together under fluorescent lights, the metallic clatter of machines drowning out even the faintest thought of freedom. Inmates were woken before sunrise, forced into lines, and shuffled into warehouses where sweat pooled on the concrete floors. They made clothes, furniture, electronics, whatever contracts demanded. It didn't matter if their backs ached or their hands bled. Pausing for too long meant punishment. And punishment at Blackridge meant more than losing privileges. It meant solitary confinement, so brutal men emerged days later like hollow shells, or work assignments doubled until their bodies gave out. For every inmate who complained, there was another who broke under silence. Some tried to keep their heads down, counting days on walls. Others found dark humor in the absurdity of it all, joking bitterly that they had traded orange jumpsuits for uniforms that might as well have had company logos stitched on the chest. But the jokes faded quickly, drowned by the reality that they were little more than machinery in human form. The billionaire, however, wore his confidence like armor. Cameras adored him. He staged tours for politicians, walking them past freshly painted hallways and smiling inmates carefully selected for the visit. They spoke rehearsed lines about learning valuable skills and finding purpose. The truth, the exhaustion, the hunger, the unrelenting work, was hidden behind locked doors the visitors never opened. Politicians applauded, investors smiled, the machine tightened its grip. Clara's investigation grew more dangerous. She followed the paper trail, uncovering shell companies designed to hide profits. Blackridge Industries, it turned out, wasn't a correctional facility. It was a holding company with tendrils stretching into shipping firms, retail giants, even government contractors. One leaked invoice revealed a multi-million-dollar deal for military equipment parts assembled inside the prison. Inmates weren't just making t-shirts anymore. They were producing for the state itself. And no one outside those walls had the faintest idea. She began contacting families of inmates, mothers and sisters who carried silent grief. One woman broke down in tears as she recounted her brother's letters. He told me he was working 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. He said he was paid 75 cents for the entire day. 75 cents. Do you know what that does to a man? Her voice cracked, but her eyes burned with anger. He didn't commit a crime big enough for this. He didn't deserve this. Another mother showed Clara her son's bruised hands on visitation day. The guards had laughed when he complained. "You're not here to rest," they told him. The billionaire dismissed the criticism with ease. In a prime-time interview, he smiled into the camera and said, "These men and women committed crimes. They owe a debt to society. I'm giving them a chance to repay that debt in a productive way." He leaned back, his words laced with authority. What's better? Sitting in a cell wasting away, or learning a trade that prepares you for the real world? To the casual viewer, it sounded noble. To those inside Blackridge, it was a lie so sharp it cut deeper than steel bars. The first major spark came when an anonymous video leaked online. Shaky footage, likely smuggled out by a guard, showed rows of inmates in sweat-drenched uniforms hunched over machines, guards pacing with rifles slung across their shoulders. The camera zoomed in on one man collapsing at his station, ignored by supervisors until he was dragged away like garbage. The video went viral overnight, shared across social media, with captions like "modern-day slavery" and "this is America's shame." Outrage erupted, Protests flared outside the prison gates, and hashtags trended for weeks. For the first time, the billionaire's mask began to crack. Reporters swarmed, demanding answers. State officials scrambled, denying knowledge of the conditions. Yet behind the denials, contracts continued, shipments left the prison, and the machine churned on. Clara published her first major piece, exposing the leaked video alongside financial records tying Blackridge to several Fortune 500 companies. The article exploded, forcing networks to cover the scandal. For a brief moment, it seemed like the walls might actually come down. Inside, however, the inmates paid the price. After the leak, the billionaire tightened control. Searches became more brutal, punishments harsher. Guards were ordered to root out rats, and rumors spread that anyone suspected of leaking information would be transferred to facilities far worse. Fear ran through the prison like poison. Still, resistance grew. Inmates whispered to one another in code, plotting how to get more evidence out. If the world saw all of it, one man said quietly to another, they'd never let it keep going. The corporations tied to the scandal released carefully worded statements. They claimed they had no knowledge of the conditions, that they had contracted in good faith. But Clara's documents told another story. Executives had met privately with the billionaire, negotiating prices for labor so low it was impossible to ignore what they were buying into. It wasn't oversight, it was partnership. And that meant more than just corruption. It meant collusion. Families of inmates began organizing. Vigils outside the prison turned into marches. Mothers carried photos of their sons. Sisters shouted through megaphones, demanding freedom. They weren't asking for luxury, only for humanity. "These are still people," one mother sobbed during an interview. "They made mistakes, but they are not slaves. My son is not a product." Her voice cracked into silence, but the words traveled far. The billionaire fought back with everything he had. Lawsuits were filed against journalists. Clara received threatening phone calls, her inbox flooded with anonymous warnings. One message read, "Stop digging or you'll be buried." She forwarded it to her editor, who responded with one chilling line, "You must be close." Meanwhile, another death rocked Blackridge. This time, it was undeniable. A 20-year-old inmate collapsed on the factory floor from exhaustion, and other inmates shouted until guards finally called for medical help. By then, it was too late. His body was carried out in silence, inmates forced back to their machines like nothing had happened. But someone smuggled out a photo. His lifeless form on a stretcher, face pale, eyes closed. When it hit the internet, the outrage doubled. This wasn't just whispers anymore, this was proof. Clara dug deeper, and with each discovery, the story grew darker. One document revealed the billionaire had been lobbying for harsher sentencing laws years before buying Blackridge. If more people went to prison, his workforce expanded. He wasn't just profiting off inmates, he was helping fill the cells. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a strategy. She stared at the evidence in disbelief. This wasn't corruption at the edges, this was systemic. The machine inside Blackridge didn't slow. Inmates were still marched to the lines, still paid pennies, still beaten down by exhaustion. Yet now the outside world was watching. Every leaked video, every photo, every testimony cracked the billionaire's armor. He smiled in interviews, denied everything, but the pressure mounted. His empire was built on silence, and silence was slipping away. Then Clara received another package. Inside was not just one contract, but dozens. Detailed agreements, company logos, shipment schedules, even memos from state officials approving the deals. At the bottom of one page was a handwritten note. "This is bigger than you think. Be careful." Her hands shook as she read. She wasn't looking at a scandal anymore. She was staring at a conspiracy. The weight of it pressed against her chest. She had the proof. She had the names. She had the trail that could destroy him. But with it came a new kind of fear. Because exposing the truth wouldn't just put the billionaire at risk, it would expose powerful corporations, politicians, and systems that had everything to lose. Clara closed her laptop and looked out her window, heart racing. Somewhere out there, people were watching her. Somewhere out there, men with more money and influence than she could fathom were deciding whether she lived to publish what she knew. And as she sat in the dim light of her apartment, one thought refused to leave her mind. If the machine inside Blackridge kept running, how many more would die before the world truly cared? The morning Clara Benson published her second article, the phones at her newsroom wouldn't stop ringing. Some were angry readers who accused her of lying. Others were terrified family members whispering that she was telling the truth. By noon, the building was swarmed with cameras. Every network wanted her face. Every headline carried her name. She had exposed more than just a corrupt businessman. She had lifted the curtain on a system America had ignored for decades. Yet Clara wasn't celebrating. She knew what was coming. She could feel the pressure closing in, the way powerful men moved when their empire was threatened. Already her editor was telling her to watch her back, to change her routines, to be careful who she spoke to. At night, she caught herself glancing over her shoulder, certain someone was following. Inside Blackridge, the fallout was immediate. Inmates who had been whispering in corners suddenly found themselves dragged into solitary cells. Guards were ordered to interrogate anyone suspected of leaking information. Entire wings were locked down, food rations cut, privileges stripped. Whispers spread that the billionaire himself had flown in, furious at the breach. Some guards swore they saw him storm through the halls, his expensive shoes echoing off the concrete, his face red with anger. Others said he ordered meetings behind closed doors with the warden, promising bonuses for loyalty and threatening ruin for betrayal. Whatever happened, conditions grew harsher overnight. The prison became a pressure cooker. Not all guards obeyed. A few couldn't stomach what they were seeing. One of them, a veteran named Miles Turner, began secretly recording. He captured footage of men collapsing on the floor, supervisors shouting orders to keep working, guards pushing inmates back onto machines after fainting spells. Turner smuggled out USB drives hidden inside his boots during shift changes. He mailed them to Clara anonymously, signing only with the initials MT. Clara's heart raced as she watched the files. They weren't just blurry cell phone clips anymore. These were clear, undeniable recordings. She had the faces of guards, the sounds of men begging for water, the proof of systematic abuse. Turner risked everything. If discovered, he would lose his job, his pension, maybe even his freedom. But something inside him had snapped. "I swore an oath to protect," he wrote in a short note, "not to enslave." The billionaire's machine moved quickly. Lawyers descended on the newsroom with lawsuits claiming defamation, demanding retractions, accusing Clara of fabricating evidence. State officials joined the chorus, insisting everything was above board. The governor appeared on television, insisting the program was a model of efficiency. Clara watched his speech with disgust, the way he smiled as though rehearsed. She knew the truth, and she had proof, but the more evidence she gathered, the more dangerous her position became. She started noticing cars idling outside her apartment for hours, strangers appearing in places she frequented. One night, returning home, she found her front door ajar, her papers scattered, her hard drives missing. Nothing else was stolen, just her work. It was a warning. Families of inmates didn't stay silent. They organized marches in state capitals demanding investigations. Protesters held signs outside Blackridge, chanting through megaphones as guards looked on from towers. "No more slavery!" they shouted. "Shut it down!" The protests grew until they reached national headlines. College students staged sit-ins, activists chained themselves to prison gates, and for the first time, America's conscience was rattled. Yet behind the noise, deals continued. Trucks still rolled out of Blackridge every night, loaded with goods that would end up in homes across the country. Clara met secretly with Turner in a parking lot late one night. He wore a baseball cap pulled low and kept glancing over his shoulder. "You don't understand," he told her, his voice hoarse. "This isn't just about Blackridge, there are more. Contracts have been signed. This is spreading." He handed her another drive. "If I disappear, you know why." Clara's hands trembled as she slipped it into her bag. Turner turned to leave, but then froze. Across the lot, a pair of headlights flashed on, and a black SUV rolled slowly toward them. Turner cursed under his breath. "Go!" he hissed. Clara didn't argue. She sprinted back to her car, heart pounding, the sound of tires screeching behind her as she fled into the night. The billionaire doubled down on his public image. He appeared on national talk shows, smiling, charming, presenting himself as a victim of fake news. He pointed to staged success stories, carefully chosen inmates who claimed the program had changed their lives. "We're teaching them responsibility," he said, leaning back confidently. "We're preparing them for society. Don't let radicals distort the truth." The audiences applauded, but not everyone was convinced anymore. Clara's reports had pierced the illusion. Then came the hearing. Pressure from activists forced state legislators to call the billionaire to testify. Cameras filled the chamber, families of inmates sat in the gallery, and Clara took a seat in the back, her notebook in hand. The billionaire walked in calmly, flanked by his lawyers, his suit pressed, his tie perfect. He swore under oath that every inmate was treated with dignity, that all work was voluntary, that wages met legal standards. It was a performance, every word crafted to sound reasonable, but Clara knew the truth. She had the recordings, the contracts, the testimony of guards like Turner. Still watching him speak with such ease, she felt the chill of realization. Men like him didn't need the truth, they had power. Turner wasn't seen again after the night in the parking lot. Clara tried calling, emailing, reaching out through mutual contacts. Nothing. His phone went dead, his apartment was empty. She drove to his neighborhood and found his mailbox stuffed, his car gone. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him in days. A week later, his resignation letter appeared on file, typed, clean, suspiciously perfect. No one questioned it publicly. Clara knew better. Her stomach sank with the weight of it. He had been silenced. Still, the movement outside the prison grew. Protests turned into clashes with police. Tear gas filled the air, rubber bullets flew, and footage of mothers dragging their children from clouds of smoke flooded the internet. America was watching, but so was the billionaire. He wasn't afraid of anger, he was afraid of exposure. And Clara, with every article, was pulling him closer to the edge. One night, Clara returned to her newsroom to find an unmarked envelope waiting on her desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, a typed message. "Stop, or you'll end up like him." No signature, no return address, just a threat as cold as the ink it was written in. She sat frozen, staring at the words, her hands shaking. She thought of Turner, of the inmates whose lives were slipping away in silence. She thought of the billionaire, smiling on television, shaking hands with governors. She thought of the machine, endless, grinding, swallowing lives without hesitation. But she also thought of the truth, and she knew she couldn't stop. The next article she prepared was her most explosive yet. It tied the billionaire directly to lobbying groups that had pushed for harsher sentencing laws, revealing how his empire thrived on filling cells. It exposed corporate partners who profited from cheap inmate labor. It named politicians who had quietly invested in the company. Her editor warned her, "If we publish this, it's war." Clara looked him in the eyes. "It already is." The night before the article went live, Clara's phone buzzed with a new message. This time it wasn't a threat, it was a video file. She hesitated before pressing play. The screen flickered, then steadied on a dimly lit office. A man's voice whispered, "They know what you're doing?" The camera turned to reveal stacks of documents, maps of prison expansions, lists of names. Then suddenly, the screen went black. A single phrase appeared. "They are watching you from the inside." Clara stared at the screen, her pulse racing. She replayed it twice, her mind scrambling. Who sent it? Was it a warning from another whistleblower? Or was it bait, a trap to lure her closer? The questions tore at her, but one thing was certain. She was no longer just up against a billionaire. She was up against an entire system designed to protect him. And now the system knew her name. The article went live at dawn, and by noon, the country was on fire. Clara's piece didn't just scratch the surface. It named names, traced money, revealed contracts, and drew a straight line from the billionaire's smiling face to the suffering inside Blackridge and beyond. It was undeniable now. He wasn't just running a prison. He was running a business built on the systematic exploitation of human beings, powered by laws he himself had helped shape. Corporations were implicated, governors exposed, legislators caught in the net. The backlash was immediate. Protesters stormed state capitals, social media erupted, and investors began to distance themselves publicly. But behind the noise, Clara knew the danger had escalated. She had pulled the mask off a man who had spent decades building an untouchable empire. He wouldn't go quietly. The billionaire responded with poise. He scheduled press conferences, his voice steady, his smile unwavering. "This is an attack," he declared, standing at a podium with the state flag behind him. "These are lies, politically motivated. We provide opportunity to people who would otherwise rot in cells. We give them dignity through work." He gestured confidently, his lawyers nodding in the background. "Don't let sensational journalism deceive you." Cameras clicked, headlines churned, but Clara noticed the way his eyes shifted slightly at every question. For all his charm, cracks were beginning to show. Inside Blackridge, those cracks felt like tremors. Guards whispered nervously about investigations. Some refused orders outright, fearing they would be caught in the fallout. Inmates sensed the unease, trading rumors about the billionaire's empire collapsing. For the first time, hope flickered in the halls. But hope came with danger. Retaliation grew harsher, punishments crueler. Those suspected of speaking to journalists were isolated for weeks. Men were transferred to other facilities in the dead of night, their families left clueless. Yet even with the clampdown, the spirit of resistance spread. Inmates began deliberately slowing production lines, sabotaging machinery, pushing back in quiet acts of defiance. The machines stuttered. Clara's editor insisted on protection. Security was hired for her, escorts assigned whenever she left the newsroom. But even with them, she felt exposed. Strange packages arrived at her home. Her tires were slashed. Once, late at night, she heard footsteps outside her window and found muddy prints on her porch the next morning. Fear pressed on her constantly, but so did resolve. She met secretly with activists, lawyers, and politicians willing to risk careers to bring the scandal to light. The network of allies grew, and for the first time, Clara felt she wasn't alone. Then came the lawsuit. The billionaire filed for defamation, seeking damages so astronomical it could bankrupt Clara's newspaper. It was a tactic as old as corruption itself, drown the truth in legal battles. Yet the lawsuit backfired. The discovery process unearthed even more documents, even more ties between the billionaire and state officials. What he had hoped would bury Clara instead unearthed more of his rot. The cracks widened. One whistleblower stepped forward publicly. A former corporate executive appeared on television, her face pale but her voice steady. She confirmed the contracts, the meetings, the exploitation. "We all knew," she said bluntly. "We profited from it." Her confession sent shockwaves, but also painted a target on her back. Days later, she was hospitalized after a mysterious car accident. Clara visited her in the ICU, holding her hand as machines beeped steadily in the background. "Don't let them bury this," the woman whispered through bruised lips. Clara nodded, her chest tight. The billionaire, meanwhile, doubled down. He poured millions into propaganda, running ads that depicted smiling inmates learning trades, hugging their families on release. The narrative was slick, polished, designed to sway public opinion. And for some, it worked. His supporters rallied online, attacking Clara as a liar, a radical, a woman trying to destroy a visionary. But for every attack, there were more who believed her. The truth was spreading too fast to be contained. Inside Blackridge, another tragedy struck. A fire broke out in one of the workshops. Inmates were locked inside, the guards too slow or unwilling to open the doors. By the time the flames were extinguished, 5 men were dead, dozens injured. Photos leaked of charred machinery, of blackened walls, of lifeless bodies carried out on stretchers. The outrage exploded again, louder than before. Protests erupted not just outside Blackridge, but across the country. For many, the fire was proof of what Clara had been saying all along. The prison wasn't about reform, it was a death trap disguised as industry. Clara received another anonymous package. This time it wasn't contracts or videos, it was a ledger, a handwritten book filled with numbers, dates, shipments, and payments. It was meticulous, damning, and personal. Every page tied the billionaire directly to profits made off inmate labor, every number proof of the empire he had built on suffering. At the back of the ledger was a single line scribbled in haste. "If this goes public, he falls." Clara stared at it, her heart hammering. She had the smoking gun. But with it came the biggest risk yet. Publishing the ledger would ignite a war beyond anything she had faced. It would not only ruin the billionaire, but drag politicians, corporations, and entire institutions into the light. Her editor hesitated. "This could destroy us," he said quietly. Clara looked him in the eye. It could destroy him. The billionaire wasn't idle. He tightened his grip, calling in favors from politicians, pressuring networks to silence Clara's reporting, leaning on judges to stall investigations. He believed his money could shield him forever. And maybe it would have, if not for what happened next. One of the guards broke completely. In a live interview, his voice shaking, he confessed everything. "We were told to treat them like property," he said. "Not people, property." His testimony couldn't be ignored. More guards followed, some anonymously, some openly. The wall of silence that had protected the billionaire for so long was crumbling. The crack in the system was no longer just visible, it was spreading fast. Clara prepared her next story, this time centered on the ledger. She worked late into the night, piecing together the numbers, cross-referencing shipments, confirming payments. Every detail had to be flawless. She knew this was the moment. Either she exposed him fully, or she would be silenced forever. The newsroom buzzed with tension, staff whispering, phones ringing, lawyers pacing. At one point, her editor leaned over her shoulder and whispered, "Are you ready for this?" Clara's fingers didn't stop typing. "I've been ready since the day I walked into this." But as dawn approached, something unexpected happened. Clara's inbox pinged with a new message. Attached was a video. She clicked, and her screen filled with the image of a man sitting in a dimly lit office. His face was hidden in shadow, but his voice was calm, measured. "You're closer than you think," he said. "But you don't understand. This isn't just about one prison. It's not just about him. It's everywhere, every state, every contract, every politician who shakes his hand. Blackridge is only one piece of a much bigger machine." The video ended abruptly. No name, no contact, just silence. Clara leaned back in her chair, her stomach twisting. For months, she had been focused on one man, one empire. But the voice was right. What she uncovered wasn't just a crack in one prison. It was a fracture in the foundation of the entire system. And if she pushed too far, she might not just take down the billionaire, she might take down everything. She saved the file, closed her laptop, and stared at the city skyline outside her window. Somewhere in the distance, the gears of the machine kept turning. Somewhere in the dark, men in suits were deciding her fate. She thought of the ledger, the protests, the fire, the voices of inmates who begged for someone to see them. She thought of Turner, vanished into silence. She thought of the billionaire, still smiling on television as if none of it mattered. And in that moment, Clara realized something terrifying. The billionaire wasn't the end of the story. He was only the beginning. By the time Clara finished cross-referencing the ledger with her notes, dawn had crept across the city. The newsroom smelled of stale coffee and exhaustion, but adrenaline kept her upright. She knew this was the moment everything would either collapse under the weight of truth or be crushed by the billionaire's machine. The ledger tied him directly to profits, listed company executives who knew, named politicians who benefited. It was the kind of evidence investigators dreamed of, the kind of evidence men with power feared most. As she printed copies, her editor paced nervously. "Once this goes live, there's no turning back," he said. Clara's eyes didn't leave the page. There never was. Outside, the protests had reached fever pitch. Entire streets were clogged with demonstrators chanting through megaphones, their signs flashing phrases like "shut it down" and "no more slavery." Police clashed with crowds, tear gas rolling across highways as news helicopters broadcast the chaos to millions. Blackridge itself was locked down tighter than ever, but the air around its walls vibrated with the sound of voices demanding freedom. For the first time, the machine was trembling. The billionaire responded with a spectacle. He booked a primetime slot on national television, standing before cameras in a crisp suit, speaking with calm authority. "This hysteria is dangerous," he said smoothly. "We are saving taxpayers billions. We are helping people rebuild their lives. Do not be deceived by radicals trying to tear down what works." His words were polished, his smile steady, but his eyes betrayed something Clara had never seen before: fear. She recognized it instantly. He was losing control. Then Clara published. The article hit the internet like a detonation. Headline after headline carried the same message. The billionaire was profiting off forced prison labor, backed by corporations and politicians complicit in the scheme. The ledger pages were published in full, contracts displayed, testimonies embedded. There was no denying it now. No spin could erase the evidence. The billionaire's empire began to crack in real time. Stock prices of companies tied to him plummeted. Politicians scrambled to issue statements distancing themselves. Lawsuits piled up faster than his lawyers could file responses. He still went on television, still smiled, still called it fake, but the tide had shifted. Inside Blackridge, inmates heard the news through whispers passed along the line. Hope surged in their chests for the first time in years. Some cried quietly in their bunks. Others tapped messages of encouragement against cell walls. Guards, once unshakable in their authority, now looked over their shoulders, uncertain whether their orders would soon be judged as crimes. The machine was faltering, not because of riots inside the walls, but because someone outside had dared to drag its blueprints into the light. But the billionaire wasn't finished. He still had allies, and he still had power. Late one night, Clara's newsroom was broken into. Computers smashed, hard drives stolen, files shredded. If not for the backup servers stored off-site, years of her work would have been gone. Clara stared at the wreckage, her chest tightening. She knew this wasn't random. It was a message, one final attempt to scare her into silence. But it was too late for fear. The story was out, and it was bigger than any one reporter. Other outlets picked it up. International papers ran features, documentaries began production. The world was watching. Congress called emergency hearings. Clara was subpoenaed to testify. She sat under the glaring lights of the chamber, cameras pointed at her, lawmakers firing questions. Her voice was steady, her evidence clear. This was not rehabilitation. This was exploitation, she said firmly. These men and women were not learning skills. They were being used, worked to exhaustion, paid pennies, while corporations profited. This was slavery by another name. The room fell silent as her words echoed across the nation. The billionaire was summoned next. He walked into the chamber with his lawyers, his suit immaculate, his smile rehearsed. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and then lied with every sentence. He called the program voluntary, claimed wages were fair, insisted every death was from unrelated health issues. He painted himself as a visionary under attack. But this time, it didn't land. Lawmakers grilled him, evidence piled against him, and the cameras captured every flicker of unease across his face. For once, charm wasn't enough. Still, he fought. His lawyers appealed every lawsuit. His lobbyists pressured every politician. Some allies fell with him, others scrambled to survive, throwing him under the bus to save themselves. Corporations began cutting ties, but not out of morality, out of fear of exposure. The system Clara uncovered was too big, too entrenched, and though the billionaire was at the center, he wasn't alone. She realized with a sinking feeling that even if he fell, the machine might live on through others. The protests reached Blackridge in full force. Thousands gathered outside the gates, chanting, singing, demanding change. Families of inmates held candles for those who had died inside. The governor, once a staunch supporter of the billionaire, finally called for an investigation, his hand forced by public outrage. Federal agents moved in, raiding offices, seizing documents. For the first time, the billionaire's empire began to buckle, but then, just when it seemed the walls were closing in, something happened that stunned the world. The billionaire vanished. His private jet left an airport under a false flight plan. His security detail scattered, his mansion emptied. Reporters camped outside his properties, cameras waiting for him to appear. But he was gone. Some claimed he fled overseas. Others whispered he was still in the country, protected by allies too powerful to expose. Clara sat at her desk, staring at the news ticker crawling across the screen. The man who had built an empire on suffering, who had turned a prison into a factory of human misery, had slipped through the cracks of the very system that once protected him. The government promised to track him down. Warrants were issued, investigations launched. But weeks passed, then months with no sign. His empire fractured, corporations faced lawsuits, politicians lost careers, but the man himself remained a ghost. Clara's articles became part of congressional records, her face recognized across the nation, her work praised as the spark that lit the fire. Yet deep down, she knew the story wasn't over, not while he was still out there. Inside Blackridge, changes came slowly. The prison was taken back under state control, the workshops shut down, investigations launched into abuses. But for the men inside, the scars remained. Families mourned the dead, survivors spoke of years stolen. Some lawsuits led to settlements, others dragged on for years. And in every interview, every speech, Clara repeated the same truth. This wasn't just about one man, it was about a system that allowed him to thrive, a system built on silence, a system that even now still existed in shadows. The final time Clara stood outside Blackridge, she watched the sun set over the razor wire. The chants of protesters echoed in the distance, the air thick with a mix of grief and hope. She thought of Turner, of the whistleblower executive in the hospital, of the families who refused to stop fighting. She thought of the billionaire somewhere out there, smiling perhaps, plotting maybe, his empire shattered, but not his arrogance. And she thought of the words she had heard in that anonymous video. It's everywhere. She knew they were true. Blackridge was only one piece. The machine was bigger, stronger, deeper, and though one crack had been forced open, the system itself was far from destroyed. As night fell, Clara closed her notebook and whispered to herself, "This isn't the end." Because in a country where prisons were businesses and men in suits could vanish into thin air, there would always be another Blackridge, another billionaire, another machine waiting in the shadows. And somewhere, another Clara would have to risk everything to expose it.